Good evening all, and welcome. Getting robbed can be a terrifying, traumatizing, and horrific ordeal. If you've ever been robbed, I'm sure you remember how it happened. So get comfortable, keep your valuables safe, and let the darkness take control. This happened in 2016, a week before Christmas Day. I still remember it quite clearly, but some parts of it are kind of foggy. Anyway, on this particular day, my mum decided to take me out shopping with her for some last-minute Christmas gifts and holiday deals. As we're leaving, I grabbed the handbag I was using at the time, a relatively worn but nice black leather Fossil brand backpack. I didn't have much in it besides my planner, a journal, my wallet, and my whole DS case. I'd gone to a gaming party the night before, and it had still been in there, but I didn't think much about taking it out. I was prone to carrying it around in my bag regardless of what I was doing. I never knew when I was going to be bored enough to pull it out and to start tending to my Animal Crossing village or train some of my prized Pokemon. We made our rounds at the mall and whatnot, and about halfway into our trip, I received a text from a high school bandmate of mine. I was a big band nerd and was particularly close with a lot of people who marched with me. The text informed me that some people from my old percussion section were planning an impromptu get-together at the movies, and I was invited to come along, as well as my mum. She was a well-liked band parent, so they had no qualms about her showing up as well. We were both pretty game, and after finishing up at the last store, we headed to the theatre to meet everybody. We had a good time, caught up, took some funny pictures and all that jazz. My mother and I headed home at around 9:30 p.m, and as soon as we pulled into our driveway, my mum asked me to retrieve the bags from our shopping endeavours. I remember that I was listening to my music on my cell phone as I got out of the car and shrugged my backpack onto my left shoulder. I trudged around to the back of the car and stood there waiting for my mum to pop open her trunk. I glanced slightly over my shoulder just in time to see what looked like an SUV whip up on our swale. My first thought was that one of my bandmates had followed me home as a joke. They were a memey bunch, so I didn't put anything like that past them. I smirked a little and turned around to greet whoever it was. But instead of facing a friend, I came face first with a barrel with what looked to be a revolver. Holding it was a short guy. I'm 5'7", and he looked to be slightly shorter than me. He had dark skin, a black, unkempt beard, and unruly curly hair to match. I remember shooting my gaze up at his face and staring at him, because I'd watched enough crime shows to know exactly what was about to go down. "Give me money," he shouted, as we made eye contact. I remember freezing, out of what I could describe as shock and maybe some fear. My first thought was that there was a chance the gun wasn't loaded, followed by the thought that I didn't wish to find out, followed by the thought that I needed to keep my eyes on this dude until he got what he wanted and left. It was at that moment that my mom rounded the back of her car and yelped at the sight of her daughter with a gun to her head. According to what she told me afterwards, she heard the man shout and assumed it was a joke. She came over to give the alleged prankster a piece of her mind. Well, Her yelp seemed to alert the gunman, because he took his eyes off me and instead ran over to her. She of course ran from him. This is where my fear really started to come into play. Given that the gun was loaded, I became very scared that the man would decide to shoot my mum if she didn't comply with what he wanted. So I ended up yelling, "Just give him your purse." She threw it at him, but then began begging to at least retrieve her car and house keys before he took it. Once again, I became scared that he'd turned the gun on her and told her to shut up. However, the gunman didn't seem to care about her anymore, because now his eyes were on me. He came back at me, waving his little revolver around and repeatedly shouting, "Give me money." I calmly shrugged my bag off my shoulder, and he hastily grabbed it before I even had it off completely. It was then that I glanced over at the car and noticed another man standing at the driver's side door. He was much taller, also dark-skinned, but despite the streetlight, I couldn't make out his face. By this point, my mother ran back towards our open garage, and the gunman seemed to have gotten what he wanted and started heading back towards his car. I, however, refused to move until they had sped off. I was still entirely frozen in place, eyes still locked on this dude robbing us dry. Just as I thought he was about to get into the car, he noticed I was still clutching onto my cell phone. I was holding it flat against my chest, with my palm covering the majority of it. I was hoping he wouldn't notice it, but those hopes were shot when he came rushing back at me and snatched it out of my hand. He ran back into his car, got in, and they zoomed off. The entire altercation lasted no more than 45 seconds. I'm rather nearsighted, and it was dark, so I failed to see the license plate as they drove away. Once they rounded the corner, my feet finally unfroze, and I calmly, yet hastily, sped-walked into our house and shut the garage door. My mum had turned back to me, as she realized I wasn't behind her when she ran inside. When I got to her, she was already trying to dial 911 on our landline, albeit hysterically. I ended up taking the phone from her and trying to dial on my own, but just our luck. Our landline had been momentarily disconnected due to maintenance issues. This was when I actually fell into panic. I frequently had lucid nightmares about criminal altercations like the one we had just had, and in each time I tried to call for help, the phone wouldn't work. It was just an odd reoccurring thing in my dreams, and to have it happen in real life was really freaking me out. We somehow got it working and got the police on the phone, and before I knew it, our block was covered in cop cars and an ambulance. I got questioned quite vigorously by the cops, and they realized I was the star witness, being that I had gotten a very good look at the gunman. They questioned me as I sat and deactivated all my cards and whatnot. As I was doing that, it dawned on me that the only real thing of value they got from me in that robbery, besides our purses, was my DS case. I had at least 20 games in that stupid case. On top of the DS, 2,000 of my Pokemon just gone like that. My hacked Animal Crossing village, gone. Just like that. While I was more than absolutely thankful that my mother and I weren't shot, I couldn't help but be slightly chapped about it. I was even more peeved when I ended up having to go down to the police station to do a police sketch, which took over 2 hours. I didn't have a phone, a journal, or my stupid DS to keep me entertained, so you can imagine how excruciating that was. News of the event ended up going viral around our area. Apparently it had been over 10 years since anything of that nature had happened in our neighborhood, and people were pretty shaken about it. Some idiots at the local news station did a piece on it, and ended up plastering our address all over the news scene. They may as well have painted a damn target on our garage door, and we had to call numerous times to get them to take it down. A few months later, the two morons struck again, a few houses down. They caught the lady of the house in the garage one night and forced her inside. They ended up robbing a lot of stuff, jewelry amongst other things, all the while her husband and younger kids were asleep upstairs. She claimed the short one wore a bandana around his face that time. Since then, we've heard nothing else from the police. As far as I know, they've never been caught. Nowadays, I frame the tale as something more comical. At the time, it was rather surreal and even scary. But having to explain to people how I had my DS stolen at gunpoint inevitably got a few laughs, and I quickly learned to laugh with it. Even though I was, and still am, fairly butthurt that I lost all my stuff. My friends even memed how the news channel spread around our address because of how utterly ridiculous it was. That I even giggle heartily at that too when it's brought up. As for the phone not working when we needed it to, that was more of a momentary fright. I got over it rather fast, and never really thought much of it again. So there you have it. To the two arse-hats who jacked my lovely shiny Sylveon, let's not meet again. 3 years ago, I was living in downtown Los Angeles, not far from the convention center. I tended to shop late at night because the traffic was low and the normally crowded grocery store was mostly empty. It was a Saturday night around 11:30 p.m. and I was stressed out from a project I'd been working on that had to be ready by Monday for an event. The stray cat I had rescued a year earlier was adding to my aggravation with her constant whining for the one specific type of food she is willing to eat. I figured getting out for a bit and going to the store would ease my mind, as well as my cat's hunger. So I headed out. The parking lot my car was in was about 200 paces down the street from the apartment building. I made it there, went to the store, found the light blue can of Fancy Feast tuna and gravy grilled that my cat oh so desired, and headed home. As I walked from the parking lot back to the building, up the dark and empty street, I noticed the figure of a person rapidly approaching in my peripheral vision. That's not good, I thought, and not a moment later, I heard a voice behind me calmly say, "Hey man," and I turned to see a tall guy in a red hat aiming a gun at my chest. I'm 6'1", and this guy towered over me. My immediate thought was not one of fear, but simply, you have to be kidding me. As I heard a second man approach from behind me, another thought entered my mind that still chokes me up to this day. If this guy shoots me, it's gonna kill my mother. I dropped the bag of Fancy Feast on the sidewalk and handed the guy my wallet, but he didn't lower the gun. Slowly I started to move away, hoping this incident was coming to an end, hoping he wouldn't fire, and never catching a glimpse of the second guy behind me. I started towards my building, which was a mere 50 feet away, keeping my eyes on the guy with the gun in case he decided to do something. Then the thought entered my mind that these guys were going to see where I lived. I didn't know what to do, but before I could act, the robber in the red hat yelled out, "Hey, where you going? What else you got?" Shit, I thought. My iPhone. I couldn't believe I was about to give this thug my phone on top of everything else. I was pretty far away at this point, and it probably wasn't the smartest decision, but I figured I could maybe convince him he's gotten everything and he'd leave me alone. I told him I didn't have anything else, and he responded, "What about your phone?" Shit. He told me if I didn't hand it over, he was going to kill me, and slowly began approaching again, gun raised. I tried to maneuver myself to place a tree between me and him in case he decided to start shooting, but it was useless. He came up to me, gun aimed again, and I handed him my phone. He turned it on to make sure it worked, then went back to staring at me with a horrible expression. Silence. It was then that I asked him to please let me go, and with one final intimidating stare, he turned and walked away, grabbing the bag of fancy feast as the other guy vanished down the street. My heart was about to pound out my chest. I ran to my front door, unlocking it as fast as I could, peeking over my shoulder to make sure they weren't returning. And I got inside. Once in my apartment, I knew I had to call someone, but I had no phone. I jumped on Facebook and messaged a few friends who I knew would be around. One responded and called the police, who arrived at my door a half hour later. We went downstairs and woke up the manager, explaining exactly what had happened. The police wanted to check the security cameras and the incident was captured on video, but sadly the street was so dark, you couldn't make anything out. You could, however, see the blinking light of the phone for a moment as the robber in the red hat turned it on. The cops asked me if I had Find My iPhone activated, which I didn't. I was new to the iPhone scene at the time, as well as smartphones in general, and didn't even know that it was a feature. My bad. They told me that most criminals are smart enough to deactivate it anyway after stealing a phone. The police left, and I returned to my apartment, feeling alive somehow. Not scared or sad, but alive, and slightly bad for my poor cat, who wasn't going to get her food of choice that night. You would think this incident was scary enough, something that would be rough for anyone to go through, but it was really only the beginning. I cancelled my credit cards. I changed every online password I could think of, Facebook, Twitter, and the like. My friend and I went to the mall and I got a new phone, and I began to think that my days of living in downtown LA were soon coming to an end, and it was time to move. Replacing everything stolen, my driver's license, credit cards, was an expected pain, but I got through it. A week passed, and I was afraid to go out to my car at night. I realized this was a problem when I had no choice but to be out late one night, and for a day leading up to it, all I could think about was how I was going to have to walk the same path from the parking lot late at night, again. I asked a friend to pick me up instead, and that night I had him drop me off in front of the building and watch me until I got inside. Another week passed, and things died down a bit. That was until one afternoon, when I walked into the building, talking to my mum on my new phone. I noticed a guy entering the building ahead of me. A tall guy I'd never seen in the building before. Keep in mind I'd been there a few years and knew what almost everyone looked like. I immediately got a bad feeling and cautiously entered the building to find him standing in the lobby laughing with someone. He turned to look at me, and I felt like a knife stabbed me in the heart. It was him, the guy who had aimed a gun at me and threatened my life not 2 weeks before. If my gut telling me it was him wasn't enough, the look of horror that washed over his face, widening his eyes and locking his stare on me, was a dead giveaway. I knew it was him. He knew it was me. And we both knew something even worse. We were living in the same building. Somehow I pretended I didn't recognize him. I sold it pretty well and continued casually talking to my mum as I headed up the stairs. Once in my apartment, I told her I had just seen the robber in the lobby of my building. She told me that that wasn't a problem. There was no way someone was dumb enough to commit a robbery 50 feet from their own front door. I tried to convince myself she was right. It couldn't be him. Not possible. I waited an hour before heading downstairs to talk to the manager about what happened. I found her outside the building, emptying trash into the dumpster, and explained the situation. My robber may be living in the building, and we may have a problem. As I described the guy to her, things suddenly got even more tense when the building's back door opened, and out he walked, with a young woman who was pushing a baby stroller accompanying him. I immediately changed the subject to sound like we weren't even talking about him. When he was out of sight and earshot, I told my manager that was the guy. She told me he had moved into the building a mere 3 days before the robbery had happened, and that she had been getting bad vibes from him ever since. She'd seen him hanging around and talking with some dark-looking characters, gangbangers, and the kind of people you don't want to mess with. The kind of people who would not hesitate to take you out if they thought that you were even the slightest threat to them. The obvious thing to do was to call the police, yet somehow the situation was not that simple. My manager had been living out there for a long time, and had a better idea of how things could play out than I did. She believed if I began pointing fingers, this guy had a lot of friends, who he could turn to in order to get rid of me, if it meant his freedom. And the one person who could royally screw up his life with one phone call to the police. It was decided that before doing anything, I needed to be somewhere safe. It was time to move, and the move needed to be quick. My manager told me they were going to waive the fee for breaking my lease, and just told me to get out ASAP. In spite of the usual horror that hunting for an apartment can be, I found a place in just a few days in a much nicer and quieter area, and decided to take it. For the next few days until my move-in date, I didn't see the guy again. I was paranoid, mostly at night, even in my apartment. I would actually push the boxes I'd pack my things in against the door just in case. I don't know why I didn't just go stay at a friend's house. I was extremely nervous every time I walked to my car, and would find myself jogging. It was a rough several days, but finally, it was moving day. My friend came over to help me get bigger items out of the apartment and into the U-Haul. He was paranoid about helping, considering what had happened. So I was cracking little jokes with him every time we saw someone, saying it was the robber. It was funny, until the actual guy who had robbed me was around the corner, walking right past us in the narrow hallway. If there was any uncertainty that it was him, it was all washed away. He was wearing the same red hat. It was very distinct, and impossible to mistake. Not only that, he turned his head as he passed us, as if trying to hide his face. It wasn't until later that I told my friend that was the guy. I didn't want to make him any more nervous. My friend told me he figured something was up, because he had noticed the guy was concealing his face as well. There was only one more thing left to get out of the apartment before leaving the building one last time. As my friend and I got off the elevator and headed towards my apartment, number 419, the door right beside it opened, and out walked the robber in the red hat. The apartment next door, 420, which was literally 1 foot from my door. This whole time, he had not only been living in the same building, but a single foot away. I don't know who could believe it less, me or him. What amazing odds. My friend and I grabbed my last item, and I hurried it into the truck, and we were gone. I planned to call the police the next day from my new apartment, but I didn't have the chance. They called me first. A female detective, I'll call Janet, asked me if I was willing to come in and look at photos and a police lineup. I told her that there'd be no need to do that, because I knew the guy wouldn't be in her lineup, because I knew exactly where he was, and proceeded to give her his address. She told me that she would call me back in a day or two. 2 days later, she called me and asked if I'd be willing to come in and talk to her. I headed to the police department near downtown and found myself sitting in a stereotypical interrogation room, like the ones you see on TV. Janet asked me to tell her the entire story from the beginning. They told me they had looked in on the guy, but the law prohibited her from telling me anything about him. She took out a rather large collection of mugshots and placed them all in front of me, perhaps 15 pictures in total, and asked if any of them looked like the guy who had robbed me. I went through each picture, narrowing them down, before getting to the last 2 possibilities. I made my choice, and I could tell from her expression that she was pleased with my decision. I asked if I'd chosen correctly, and she said she couldn't answer, but did say I'd done a good job. I said that if they already had the guy's mugshot on file, this obviously wasn't the first time he'd had a run-in with the law. Again, she couldn't answer, but gave me a non-verbal nod of the head in compliance, and told me that we would be in touch. A few days later, the phone rang. The number was hidden, so I knew it was the police. This time, it was a man, Jim. He told me the police had done their research, and they were going to get the guy, and asked me a few basic questions, mainly about the baby and the woman I saw him with behind the building that day. I guess they wanted to know if they were walking into a potential hostage situation, or one where a baby would be in danger. He also got my iPhone serial number, in case they found it, which would obviously be the smoking gun. He told me to expect a call the next day. The next day, I found myself back at the police station at a table with Jim and Janet. They'd picked the guy up, but not found any of my belongings. Obviously, he had stolen the phone to sell it, so it was probably long gone. And the fancy feast? Well, the credit cards were useless since I'd cancelled them, and it would have been completely stupid to hang on to the wallet. I asked them how he had reacted when they were arresting him. They told me, like someone who knew it was coming. No surprise at all. In spite of no physical evidence, they were convinced he was the robber, based on certain things they couldn't disclose. And it was then they told me a second person had been robbed the same night, by someone matching my guy's description. Unfortunately, the person had vanished, and the cops were unable to get in touch with him. I was it. My word apparently was the only evidence against the Red Hat robber. Some time passed, and I didn't hear anything else about the situation. I hoped it had died down, and was in the past. If they let the guy go, there was nothing I could do about it. I was somewhere I felt safe, and was willing to just move on. Then one day while driving, my phone rang and the word "hidden" came up. I answered to hear Janet's voice. It was then that she told me in a few days she would be driving me to the LA County Courthouse to give testimony against the robber at a hearing. I felt my heart drop. I don't like public speaking. I didn't want to see that guy in person ever again, and I was going to have to sit on a witness stand with him staring at me and tell everything that happened to lawyers and a judge and who knew who else. The morning came, and Janet and I got into an unmarked police car and headed to the courthouse. Once inside, we were told to sit on a bench and wait. It felt like forever, but finally I was called in. I found myself in a huge courtroom with literally hundreds of people filling the seats staring at me. And there at the table, the robber. He was wearing a blue prison garb. When I saw his face, I again got that same shot to the chest I felt when I'd seen him in the lobby of my old apartment. I knew it was him. I had to recount the entire story to everyone with him staring at me the whole time. Then, that moment you always see in TV crime shows and movies comes. The lawyer asked me if the person who robbed me was sitting in the room, and if I could point him out. The robber and I locked eyes, and he began to slowly shake his head, quietly telling me, no. Not in a threatening way, but in a scared shitless, if this guy says yes, then I'm screwed way. I pointed at him and said it was him. His head dropped, as did the heads of several people in the audience, family and friends, I guess. After that day, I heard nothing else for the longest time. Many months passed, and I was hoping that was the end of it. I honestly didn't care much about what happened to him. If anything, I did figure they'd call me. Then one day, my Skype started logging in and out all by itself. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I realized I'd never changed my Skype passwords after the phone was stolen. So many to change I'd overlooked that one. And wherever my stolen phone was all this time later, someone was playing with it. And I realized I had so many conversations with people about the robbery over Skype text, and due to my mistake of not changing that password, whoever had the phone could read every one of them. The police had told me there was no way to recover the phone, so I figured all I could do was change the password, which I did. And Skype stopped logging in and out by itself. I called the police and asked for an update on my case, and they told me there currently was none, but they would be in contact soon. Some time later, I woke up to my phone ringer, and the caller was listed as hidden. I answered, and it was the district attorney. She began explaining to me that there was no evidence against the red hat robber other than my word, and in a he said type of case, there can be no conviction. The robber had sat in jail for nearly 6 months at that point, which felt like a good lesson, and the attorney told me she was calling to see if I was okay with dropping the whole thing, in spite of her completely believing he was guilty. She said she had felt I had been through enough, and if we pushed on with the case, it would be a nightmare. The robber's attorney would hire a person whose one job would be to find dirt on me and turn me, the victim, into the villain. She threw some truth at me that because I'm white and he's black, they would play the race card and say I was just trying to put another poor black guy away. She told me they would bring up everything they could find about me that could help set this guy free, and sadly, that was their job, and ultimately, it would all be for nothing. I asked her that if I said it was okay to let him go, would I ever have to hear about this ordeal again? She told me that the moment I hung up, this entire thing would be over for me, but not to worry. In her experience, these guys never learn, and she has no doubt he'll do something again and wind up right back in jail. It happens almost every time. It was then that she told me something I did not know that spun the entire situation in my mind. The guy who had robbed me was only 16 years old. He was 6'7" and looked much older. She confirmed that the baby was in fact his, and that he'd been spending his time in jail learning crafts and partaking in whatever kinds of social activities they had in places like that. He was just a stupid kid. One stupid enough to rob someone 50 feet from his own front door. I never heard anything else about the case, or about the red-hatted robber, but before the DA hung up, she said one final thing I'll always remember. The crime in this case was not a stolen iPhone or credit cards. It wasn't the threat of my life, or even the stack of fancy feast. The real crime was that whether I knew it or not, this guy had put a permanent scar on my brain that I would carry for the rest of my life. I would never forget this had happened, and it would change my life forever. My stolen sense of security was the real crime. I still go out walking at night, and hardly ever think about what happened. If anything, I feel it made me stronger. I know the Red Hat robber is out there somewhere. I know that he's just a stupid kid. I hope that this ordeal was as much a lesson for him as it was for me. Whether it was or not, I do hope that we never meet again. This happened in the mid-afternoon of Saturday, December 22nd, 2007. I know this because I wrote a live journal post about it and looked up the date as I posted it. First, a little background. At the time, I was 42 years old. I'm basically a fat, bald white guy. I was visiting my mother in my hometown in west central Alabama. Very rural, quite small, with about 1,800 people in total. That neighborhood was typical for a small, dying southern town. A bunch of older retired people whose children have since all moved away. My mother had just turned 70 at the time, and that was about a median age of the people in the neighborhood. Her house was on a corner by itself, and behind that was a small forest and then a cow pasture. So her lot was the back edge of the neighborhood. The block across the street from her held about 7 homes, 2 of which faced her house. The yards are big. My mother's was about an acre, and the homes were built in the 60s, and everything is a bit more sprawly than suburban subdivisions. It was 3 days before Christmas, and we were getting ready to go to Tuscaloosa, the closest big city, to attend a family Christmas party thrown by some cousins on my father's side. They'd invited me and my mother, and we were bringing my uncle on my father's side with us. Even though it was late December, this was Alabama, so it wasn't frigid outside by any stretch of the imagination. It was chilly, 40s to 50s, but not cold, at least not to me. I was wearing a thin, grey hoodie. My mother had gone to her parents' house to make sure that they were okay, and I was outside at her house getting my car ready to accommodate 3 people, gifts, and food. I noticed 2 teenage boys in hoodies similar to my own, walking slowly down the street. They didn't even register the first time, just people moving on the street. When they came by the second time, I glanced up to see who they were. It's a tiny town, and everyone knows everyone, but I didn't recognize them. Well, it was Christmas. I just assumed one of the neighbors had family over too. I think I even waved as they approached the second time. Then I locked the car and went inside to take a shower and get ready for the party. I'll note that they were still in front of my mother's house when I went inside. 20 minutes later, I'm dressed and ready, and find my mother watching out the window. The police car, the small town is small enough that it only has 1 officer on duty on weekends, lights flashing, is parked at the house 1 block up from my mother's. Seems that while I was in the shower, the 2 boys had walked past our house, turned the corner to the right, and walked past the across the street neighbor's house to the next house up, where Mr. B, a guy in his mid-70s, was also out in his yard. The 2 boys had approached him and struck up a conversation. Then they pulled out guns, robbed him in his own yard in broad daylight, and fled. Their first trip around the block was to choose a victim, apparently, and the second was to rob them. I got chills at just thinking that if I hadn't gone inside at the right time, I might have been one of the ones robbed. And I had no cash on me. What might they have done if their chosen victim didn't have what they wanted? What if my mother had come back home at just the wrong time? Because we're a small town, we heard through the grapevine that Mr. B and the cops already suspected who the boys were. There was a dogfighting ring that was discovered right in the same neighborhood up the next block up. The boys were connected to that group. An unrelated meth house turned up one more block up from that, right across the street from the city elementary school. The town used to be idyllic and safe, but the wrong element made that no longer true. My mother left that town 2 years later, after living there for 50 years, and now lives in a much safer neighborhood in a much larger town closer to where I live. Boys who brazenly robbed an old man at gunpoint in his own front yard 3 days before Christmas? Let's never meet again. This happened to me in Thailand a few years ago. I've always been a backpacker and have never really ran into trouble throughout my travels. I've also since been back to Thailand and see this as an isolated experience, so it didn't prevent me from continuing to travel. In fact, I'm on a flight to Bali right now. I'm writing this on my iPad. Thailand is a backpacker haven, seeing millions of travelers every year, especially solo backpackers. They come for the culture, good food, and of course, amazing beaches. However, as much of a paradise as it is, you have to keep your wits about you, as it does have a seedy underbelly. The great thing about traveling solo is that you end up meeting a lot of other travelers, especially in hostels. This experience started in a hostel on the island of Koh Lanta. I had met this Australian dude, and he was keen on getting the party started. I also felt in the mood, and together, we started rallying together at the other hostels for a pretty crazy pre-drinking session, complete with creating our own buckets full of Thai whiskey and some off-brand Red Bull called M150. Word on the street, this energy drink has traces of speed in it. It goes without saying that we were all pretty drunk within an hour or so. The Australian guy kept going on about a place called the Monkey Bar, and that he had seen signs about it advertising a party beach. When we ran out of drinks, we didn't really know where to go, and the Aussie guy kept insisting that we go to Monkey Bar. With all of us being wasted, we decided, why not? We went outside the hostel and hailed a pickup truck, capable of carrying the 10 of us. When we informed the driver that we wanted to go to the Monkey Bar, he gave us a weird look and kept saying no. All of us, being intoxicated, insisted he takes us there. He finally agreed. This was the first feeling I got that something seemed off, but no one else was bothered, so I went along with it. When we arrived to the dark alley between some bush about 50 meters from the beach, I didn't hear any music. This is when I got the second off feeling that something wasn't right. The others started making their way up towards the beach to the bar as I followed along. I noticed the driver had parked and followed us up the beach bar. Odd. He was working, so why didn't he drop us off and leave us to continue driving others around the island? As I had suspected when I got to the bar, there was no beach party. Just a handful of people sitting around drinking in a dimly lit environment. Again, I got a weird feeling and immediately wanted to leave. I told the others there wasn't a beach party and that we should go somewhere else. But since a lot of the others weren't really moving, no one listened to my pleas. Suddenly, a shirtless Thai guy wearing a bandana bursts into the center of our group, effectively hitting my shoulder in the process, obviously on purpose. He then starts pushing around some of the guys in our group, and even throwing light kicks at them. The guys in our group, being super drunk, start pushing him back. The bad feelings I had started to get worse. If there's one thing I've learned from my travels, it's never mess with the locals. As this was going down, things get a little bit more heated. I decided to start to be very insistent, telling everyone in the group we should leave, since there was no party, and this guy was sketchy. Not to mention our driver was still there. Finally, everyone agreed, and we started walking down the dark alley between the bushes to get to the pickup truck. As I looked over my shoulder, I noticed the Thai guy was following us. At this point, my survival instinct is kicking in hard, and I'm walking faster towards the pickup truck. As we all start loading in, the Thai guy pulls out a gun and begins screaming at us in Thai. None of us have any idea of what he's saying, as he's waving the gun at us and flipping out. We all immediately get down in the back of the pickup, except some of the drunk guys we were with who hadn't made it yet. He was pointing the gun point blank at one of the guys who was fighting back to him earlier. We screamed at him to get in and for the driver to start driving. He did, and thankfully we made it out of there without the Thai guy firing his gun. As we're driving back to the hostel, the whole party mood had been ruined, with a couple of the girls crying the way back. I noticed the Aussie dude wasn't with us at all. Some said to turn back to get him, but the majority wanted to get back to the hostel, so we did. When I got back to the hostel, I met some other travelers who didn't come with us, and told them the whole story. They had some flowers, of the green variety, in which we partook to help me forget what had happened, and it did cause an hour later. One of the guys who was now with me in the pickup truck said, "That was so crazy, wasn't it?" And my response was, "What was?" That seemed to be how it goes with backpacking. Crazy stuff happens, but you tend to move on very quickly. After another hour passed, I was in a daze from more green, and I saw the Aussie guy walk in the hostel. Immediately I was like, "Dude, where the hell have you been?" Apparently he went straight to the bar to drink, and was talking to some guy there. He was so drunk, he didn't even know the whole thing happened, and wondered why we'd all left so early. I filled him in, but he was too drunk to really get how serious it was, or that he had led us to some sketchy bar to potentially get robbed or worse. I hope me and no other traveler ever meets that crazy guy again. This happened around 5 years ago, in the area I grew up in. Back then, I was up to no good, but I have since turned my life around. At the time, I was one of the very few people that moved large amounts of pain pills in the city. The rest of the people trying to move these pills had them imported from sketchy people from around the world, so you didn't always get what you paid for, and the strength would vary a lot. I managed to get a hold of some real ones from within the country, and still within their original packaging. Word quickly got out, and I wasn't very well liked since I guess I took business from people. This incident happened on a hot summer's day, and I decided to go to the park to relax. Where I lived, there was a main road with apartments on both sides in front of my complex. There was a parking lot, and to the right of it, another set of apartments with trees separating that complex from another. I was walking in the wooded area between the two complexes as a shortcut to get to the park. So I'm just walking, minding my own business, when I begin hearing gunshots. They sound really close, and I hid behind a huge tree. I didn't really know what was going on, but looking around I could see the foliage around me move with each gunshot. In retrospect, I guess it was pretty obvious, but they do say hindsight is 20/20. But anyway, I waited for silence and then peeked behind the tree to see what the hell was going on. I managed to get a quick peek of a guy holding a gun, leaning back into his apartment. Change of plans here. I ended up running back to my block as fast as I could when I then slowed down. Pretty bummed out at this point, as I really wanted to go to the park. Anyway, at this point, I'm not sure where to go. It might have been a good idea, but before I was able to give it much thought, I saw two guys appear behind me. Feeling a bit uneasy, understandable perhaps, I'm keeping my eyes on the guys and just trying to keep walking, as if I knew where I were going. It was weird. They didn't really talk to each other, and then they kind of split up on the walking path, still heading towards me. I knew something wasn't right, and I upped my pace to try and test it out. That's when one of them reached for something in his pocket. I still don't know where the hell to go, but I ended up deciding to go to my childhood friend's apartment, which was on the other end of this area. Oh, and her apartment complex has a code, which she usually kept me up to date on since we'd hang out a lot. Back then, I'm not sure if it's still like this, but the code changed every few months. Anyway, I finally make it to her apartment and punch in the code. Wrong code. I try again, and it's wrong. So now I'm panicking because I can't see these guys anymore and I can't get into this stupid building. I called her phone and she buzzed me in, and I ran up the stairs and explained the situation. We played cards and just hung out until the evening, and she offered to walk me home, but I declined. I just felt it a bit unnecessary to put her at possible risk. I did manage to get home safely, as a couple of weeks before this, two people had picked me up and tried to carry me into their car while I was on my way to collect food. I have a feeling that they're the same people, but I couldn't really see the shooter's face very well, probably from the adrenaline, so I guess I'll never know. I was so close to being robbed, taken, or who knows what. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. As the longest of the stories exemplified quite nicely, when you get robbed, it's not just about your stuff or the crime. It's especially bad when you don't feel safe anymore, as that's something that takes a long time to go away, and you have to live with it every day. That's the real crime. How you feel, and how uncomfortable you become doing stuff that you should be fine doing. I suppose it's the same when you have creepers or stalkers. It's that sense of security that gets stolen away from you. That is the real crime. Along with the other crimes that they do, if there are more crimes. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed tonight's video. If you did, let me know by dropping a like and leaving a comment with your opinion of it. If you'd like more robbery stories, as it is a new topic on this channel, be sure specifically to let me know, as I have plenty more if you'd like them. Don't forget, there is new content coming to you every night, so be sure to subscribe and press the bell icon to be up to date every time I post. If there's a story that you would like to share and have read on the channel soon, all you need to do is send me an email or check out my Reddit page. All the information is available to find in the description. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.